The Force is old and full of shadows.
The relay station smelled like burning wire and old fear. That was the first thing Anakin registered when the breach charge blew the service hatch. Not the pressurized atmosphere equalizing with a slow hiss, not the emergency lighting strobing red across the corridor walls, but the smell. Every SIS installation had its own version of it. The particular combination of droid lubricant and recycled air, and the low-grade sweat of whatever organic crew had been stationed here before they heard the Republic was coming and started making fast decisions about their lives. "Rux," he said, keeping his voice flat. Left corridor, 20 meters, 2 B2s and something heavier behind the blast door. Captain Rux, a compact, desert-tanned man who had kept himself alive through 4 years of this war, by treating Anakin Skywalker's instincts with the same faith other men reserved for mathematics, signaled the flanking squad without a word. His armor was scratched to gray at every joint, the armor of a soldier who had stopped being afraid of specific dangers and had moved on to fearing only the abstract ones, the kind you couldn't hear coming. Anakin went right. The B-1 units in the right corridor were already rotating toward him when he ignited his blade. Blue light flooded the passage in a single stuttering flash, and they were dead before the first one completed its turn. 4 strokes. No wasted motion. He stepped over them the way a man steps over furniture in an unlit room and kept moving toward the comm hub at the station's core, listening to the sounds of Rux's squad doing clean, efficient work behind him. Controlled bursts of blaster fire, no shouting. The language of men who had been fighting alongside each other long enough that the battle had become a conversation requiring no words. The comm hub was locked behind an encryption protocol that would have taken a standard slicer 6 minutes to crack. Anakin broke it in under 1, because he'd seen this specific lock variant on 3 different SIS stations, and the manufacturer hadn't updated the backdoor sequence since Geonosis. "Captain?" Anakin called back. "Secure the perimeter. I need time in here." Sir Rux's voice, no inflection. The man communicated entire paragraphs through the deliberate absence of inflection. Anakin sat down at the terminal. He found the encrypted package well into the search, buried in a compression archive labeled with a routing code he almost passed over. Almost, except that he'd seen that particular routing syntax once before on a captured Dooku communic 3 years ago, and his memory for codes had long since stopped being useful and started being a liability. He flagged it for Republic intelligence. Then, because he was Anakin Skywalker and 4 years of war had made him constitutionally suspicious of anything that seemed like it should simply be handed to someone else, he copied it to his personal data spike first. He told himself it was standard protocol. He told himself that all the way back to the cruiser. His cabin aboard the Resolute was exactly large enough to contain a bunk, a desk, and the bare minimum of personal effects a Jedi general was expected to maintain. He'd long since stopped pretending he kept it tidy. There was a scarf of Padams draped over the back of the chair that he technically wasn't supposed to have and had no intention of removing. He sat at the desk in the deep hours of the ship's night cycle and ran the decryption. It took him 2 hours. The cipher was Sith grade, not a term he used loosely, because he'd seen enough of Dooku's correspondence to understand what standard SIS encryption looked like, and this was several layers beneath that, in a place that Republic intelligence's standard tools would have flagged as corrupted data and quietly discarded. Whatever this was, it hadn't been meant to be found. The audio file opened, and Palpatine's voice came out of the speaker. Not the performance of it, not the carefully modulated warmth he deployed in Senate addresses, or the paternal affection he calibrated specifically for Anakin. Something underneath that voice, older and harder and utterly certain of itself. The voice of a man who had never once in his life been accountable to anything outside his own will. Anakin went very still. The Geonosis supply chain remains satisfactory, Lord Tyrannus. The banking protocols are routed as instructed. Sand Hill has been cooperative. Dooku's voice, responding, measured, almost bored. And the timeline? Unchanged, the boy remains useful for another 6 months at minimum, perhaps longer if the Outer Rim campaigns run as projected. The boy, Anakin's hand, resting flat on the desk, closed slowly into a fist. And Order 66? The inhibitor protocol is performing within parameters across all tested batches. When the time arrives, the Army will turn on a single command. Clean, surgical, and total. A pause, carrying beneath it something that wasn't quite pleasure, but lived in the same neighborhood. The Jedi will never see it coming from their own men. The file ran for another 11 minutes. Anakin did not move through any of them. He listened to the complete architecture of it, the war's dual financing on both sides, the deliberate prolonging of campaigns that could have ended, the clinical references to clone batch testing and compliance percentages. He listened to Dooku discuss Jedi casualty rates with the detachment of a man reviewing crop yields. He listened to Palpatine, his mentor, the man who had called him son with a warmth that had felt, for 20 years, like the realest thing in a life full of things he wasn't permitted to name. Say the boy's usefulness with the same tone a general used when discussing ammunition stockpiles. Expendable, finite, already accounted for in someone else's arithmetic. When the file ended, the cabin held a silence that had weight. Anakin looked at his hand. He was gripping the edge of the desk hard enough that the synthwood had begun to crack along the grain, a white fracture line spreading from beneath his fingers like a fault finding its depth. He released it. He made himself breathe. He ran the arithmetic. If he brought this to the council, Palpatine's legal apparatus would bury it in a Senate committee before the week ended. An illegal slice of a diplomatic channel, presented by Anakin Skywalker, the volatile, rule-bending, insufficiently trusted Jedi who had never quite fit the mold, leveled against the most beloved man in the Republic. No physical evidence of the original transmission. Nothing the Council could act on without political exposure that would take months to navigate. And in those months, Padme, suddenly interesting to a cornered Sith Lord who needed leverage. Ahsoka, who trusted Anakin with the uncomplicated faith of someone who hadn't yet learned to protect it. Obi-Wan, whose decency was so thorough it had never equipped him for a man who wore decency as camouflage. He thought about Palpatine saying the boy's usefulness and felt something move through him that wasn't anger. Anger was hot. Anger was the thing that had taken him to a Tusken camp on Tatooine that had cost Ahsoka her trial, that had put a saber in his hand more times than he could count for reasons that hadn't been as clean as he'd told himself afterward. Anger moved fast and broke things and left him cold and ashamed by morning. What moved through him now had no temperature at all, a decision forming at some depth below feeling, in the place where feeling had already been processed and distilled into something harder and more permanent. The place where a man stopped reacting and started reckoning. He thought about Rex. About Rux. About every sun-weathered face in the 501st, every soldier who had stood beside him in the dark and bled for a war they didn't know was theater. About what clean, surgical, and total meant for those faces. He stood up from the desk and crossed to the viewport. Hyperspace wrapped around the ship, the blue-white tunnel of faster-than-light transit like a second skin. Somewhere at the other end was Coruscant. Somewhere in Coruscant was a man who had spent 20 years learning the precise weight of Anakin Skywalker's fears and building a careful architecture on top of them. He put his hand flat against the transparent steel. He had been trained to report threats through proper channels. He had been trained to trust the Council's judgment on matters of this magnitude. He had been trained, above everything, to believe that the Jedi way was the light's best expression in a dark galaxy. He believed all of that. He believed it the way he believed in Padme, as a bone-level certainty that no argument could fully reach. And he understood, standing at that viewport with 11 minutes of audio still running behind his eyes. That belief and action were not the same thing, that the moment sometimes arrived when a man had to decide which one he was actually willing to live inside. He was not naive about what he was considering. He had heard masters discuss the dark side seduction often enough to understand the shape of it, the way it came not as something monstrous, but as something reasonable, even noble, as the only available path. He could feel the architecture of that seduction now, feel how neatly his current position fit the template. A man with a secret, facing an impossible problem, convinced that unconventional means were the only viable ones. He stood with that knowledge and did not flinch from it, and did not pretend it resolved anything. What he kept coming back to, the thing that refused to be processed into something simpler, was not his own survival. It was Rex's face in the field. It was Rux lowering a comm unit after a status check. It was the specific, unremarkable trust of men who had placed their lives in his hands without reservation, and who were, at this moment, running programming that could be overridden with a code word and turned on everything they believed in. That wasn't seduction. That was arithmetic. A man could debate the condition of his soul. He couldn't debate the inhibitor protocol performing within parameters. The scarf on the chair caught the blue light from the viewport. "He calls me son," Anakin said to the empty cabin, to the indifferent tunnel of stars. "He's already written the day he burns me down." When he finally moved, it was toward the desk, and the data spike still plugged into the terminal, and the engineering schematics he kept in a locked partition that no one had ever asked about. The door between what he had been and what he was going to become was not a dramatic thing. It was just a moment, ordinary as any other, in which a man sat down at a desk and began to work. If the Jedi won't kill a Sith Lord, he thought, pulling up the first file, I will become something worse than one. The terminal hummed. The ship ran on through the dark. The Coruscant underlevels had their own weather, not the kind that came from clouds or pressure systems, the kind that came from 10,000 years of infrastructure decay, from cooling vents that hadn't been serviced since the mid-Republic and heat exchangers that bled thermal exhaust in slow rolling waves. At the deep levels, the light from the city above was a faint orange smear across a permanent ceiling of smog, and everything that lived down here had long since made its peace with never seeing the actual sky. Anakin moved through it in civilian clothes, rough spun laborer's coat, hood drawn, the kind of unremarkable outfit the underlevels produced and consumed in enormous quantities. He'd left his lightsaber in its concealment rig beneath the coat. He'd left his comlink routing his location signature to a static beacon near his assigned billet on the upper residential tier. As far as the temple's tracking protocols were concerned, General Skywalker was in his quarters, sleeping. He'd been building this operation for 9 days. The name was Veth Sorn, mid-level dark side relic broker, operating out of a repurposed atmospheric processor deep in the city's lower infrastructure. The kind of business that survived down here because nobody with authority wanted to come far enough underground to shut it down. He dealt in Sith artifacts, corrupted Kyber fragments, old dark side texts that the Council would have confiscated and the black market paid well for. Not a Sith. A man who played with darkness the way some men played with fire, carefully, convinced he understood it, wrong about that conviction in ways that hadn't caught up to him yet. The processor building announced itself through smell before sight, ozone and old metal, and something underneath that Anakin felt more than detected, a wrongness in the force that registered like a cold hand pressed between the shoulder blades. Veth Sorn was force-sensitive in the way a bruise was. Not developed, not disciplined, just raw and reactive. He could feel things approaching. He used it the way a street animal used its ears, which meant the approach had to be something he couldn't feel. Anakin stopped in the shadow of a support column 40 meters out and went completely still. This was the part of himself he didn't discuss with Obi-Wan. The part that had grown in the years since Geonosis, in the gap between what the Jedi had taught him about the Force and what the war had actually asked of him. He reached inward and found the turbulent brightness that was his signature. Restless, enormous. The thing that made Yoda's ears come up every time Anakin entered a council chamber. And he didn't try to make it smaller. He simply went somewhere else inside it. Beneath the warmth, there was a layer he didn't visit unless he needed to. A cold place. The part of him that had stood in a hut on Tatooine surrounded by the dead and felt nothing for 3 full minutes until he'd consciously manufactured grief to fill the absence. He let that layer rise, just enough, like opening a door a crack. To Sorn's unrefined sensitivity, he would disappear, not because his presence was hidden, but because nothing in Sorn's limited experience had prepared him to recognize the particular quality of a Jedi who had learned to make himself feel like a wall. He moved. Veth Sorn was a slight man past 50, with the pale, dry complexion of someone who hadn't been in natural light in years, and the nervous, darting energy of an animal that lived inside its own fear. He was examining something on a work table, a kyber crystal, fractured, held in a containment field that hummed with the specific frequency of corrupted force resonance. Red, not fully bled. Partway there, like a wound that hadn't finished becoming a scar. Sorn felt him before he saw him. The man's head came up fast. "You're not from the hut," he said, not a question. "No," Anakin said. "Then who?" He stopped. He was looking at Anakin's face, and something in what he saw there had made further questions feel inadvisable. "I need that crystal," Anakin said, "and the process you used to begin the bleeding. All of it, the methodology, the materials, the temperature calibration for the containment field." Sorn's hand moved towards something beneath the work table. Anakin crossed the room in 2 strides and caught the wrist before it arrived, holding it with the specific, precise force of someone who understood exactly how much pressure communicated that this avenue was closed. "I need you to understand something," Anakin said. His voice was very calm. The calmness of the cold place, coming more easily now than it ever had in his formal training. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to take what I came for. Whether that's a conversation or something else depends entirely on the next 30 seconds. Sorn looked at him for a long moment. Then, "How much?" "Nothing," Anakin said. "I'm taking it." He released the wrist. He stood with his hands at his sides and waited while Veth Sorn ran the only calculation available to him and arrived at the only sensible answer. "Take it," Sorn said. "All of it. I don't want whatever comes next." Anakin looked at him. "Smart," he said. He performed the bleeding ritual alone in his billet, deep in the night. He'd read everything available on the process. The temple archives contained more than the council would have been comfortable with, filed under theoretical Sith studies, and never intended as operational instruction. A kyber crystal was a living thing in the Force, one that resonated and responded and chose. Bleeding it meant breaking that resonance deliberately, taking something that sang in the light and teaching it to scream instead. It required sustained contact with the dark side, applied with enough force and consistency to bend the crystal's fundamental nature until it bent toward you. He held the crystal in both hands and let himself remember. Tatooine. The hut. The specific sound his mother made when he found her. The arithmetic of what he'd done afterward, conducted in cold silence while the twin moons arced overhead. He didn't use the memory the way he'd used it then, as something uncontrolled, a dam giving way. He used it deliberately, the way a craftsman uses a tool, applied it to the crystal in sustained, measured pressure. "This is what I am capable of. This is the thing I carry. Become something that can serve that." The crystal fought back. Kyber resisted this. The resistance was not metaphorical. He could feel it pushing against his palms. Something small and fundamental insisting on its own nature with everything it had. He pressed harder, not with anger, with the settled, purposeful weight of someone who has made a decision and is seeing it through. His mother's face, the sand, Padam in his nightmares. The crystal cracked through. Not a physical fracture, an internal shift in resonance he felt as a high, clean tone dropping suddenly to something rougher and lower, the way a voice drops when its owner has stopped pretending they aren't in pain. It went red. Completely red. the red of something that had accepted the loss of its previous life. The lightsaber took the rest of the night to build around it. His hands knew this work better than almost anything else. The new design was longer than his standard saber, the blade geometry adjusted for heavier strikes, the grip balanced for a fighting style that no longer had any reason to pretend it was Jedi form. When it was finished, he ignited it once, briefly, and the red light filled the room like the beginning of something that couldn't be taken back. The armor came together over the following days. He sourced the Frick alloy through a contact in Dexter Jettster's old underworld network, a supply channel he'd known existed for years without ever needing to use, routed through intermediaries. Paid in unmarked credit chips, logged as industrial material for a personal engineering project. The synthweave base he constructed himself from first principles. The stealth field generator came off a wrecked separatist infiltration unit he'd personally shot down over Christophsis and logged afterward as destroyed. The mask he built last. A featureless black faceplate designed to take the light from a room and return nothing. He fitted the vocoder last, calibrating it until the output was correct, deeper, rougher, stripped of everything warm or human, and beneath every word the slow metronomic rhythm of simulated breathing. Patient, deliberate. The sound of something that you had already failed to notice until it was too late. He held the mask in both hands for a long time. Then he put it on. The HUD resolved. The vocoder activated. The breathing started. He spoke one word into the empty room. Vader, the voice that came back, was not Anakin Skywalker's voice. It was the voice of something that had decided what it was, and was not going to revisit the decision. He heard it and felt a recognition that was colder than anything the crystal ritual had produced. Colder because it was not foreign. Because some part of him had always known this voice was in there, waiting for the right architecture to give it shape. He walked to the piece of salvaged durasteel propped against the wall and looked at his reflection. The armor absorbed the light. The mask gave nothing back. The red blade hummed at his side. And behind the mask, visible in the durasteel's imperfect mirror, Anakin Skywalker's eyes, looking out from inside everything he had built. This is what I am, he thought. Both of these things, at once, without apology. The breathing continued, somewhere above the underlevels. Above the smog and the orange light and the 10,000 years of accumulated city, the Republic slept. Vader watched his own reflection and decided that was about to change. Cass Tower occupied the upper third of a Senate district spire built during the Republic's last genuine period of optimism. All clean vertical lines and imported stone. The kind of architecture that believed in itself completely and had not yet been given reason to stop. Darrow Fenn had lived in its penthouse for 11 years. The intergalactic banking clan employed him as a senior liaison officer. He attended the right functions, filed the correct disclosures, maintained a professional reputation sufficiently clean that the word corruption would have required substantial legal scaffolding to attach to him in any official document. What the documents didn't contain was the secondary ledger routing untraceable credit transfers through shell corporations that fed. Through 4 carefully constructed layers, directly into Palpatine's private war chest. The one that financed the parts of the war that neither the Republic Treasury nor the banking clan's official CIS contracts were supposed to know about. Anakin had found the ledger in the relay station's archive. 3 days to trace the full routing chain, 2 more to study Fenn's security rotation. Vader cut a single power node in the early hours before dawn, not the whole grid. Just 1 floor's substation, far enough from the penthouse that monitoring registered a routine fluctuation. Close enough to the external sensor grid that the cameras on the east face went to backup power for long enough. He came up the exterior on magnetic grapple, the chameleon weave bending the light around him in a shimmer that security cameras read as atmospheric interference and battle droids registered as nothing at all. He came over the east parapet onto a maintenance walkway and assessed. 2 guards at the stairwell entrance debating a sabak debt. a third making a slow circuit of the south end with the unhurried rhythm of someone who had done this rotation so many times it had stopped requiring his attention. He moved south. The third guard heard nothing, his eyes passing over Vader twice without resolving anything into alertness. The stairwell responded to a slicer spike in seconds. He took the stairs. The turbolift logged entries in a system that backed up to off-site servers, and the stairwell cameras were on the same node circuit he'd cut. He moved through 12 floors of quiet. The penthouse security was different. Better equipment, better people, the kind of private contractor work that cost enough to actually deliver competence. 4 guards positioned in total. Vader worked the sequence in his mind, simultaneous on the 2 outer guards, the lift guard before he could reach his comm, the interior position last. Below a noise threshold, clean, he crossed the outer corridor in 4 strides and had both guards down before the second one completed his turn. Controlled strikes. The prisoner taking technique calibrated to the point where they would wake with headaches rather than not waking at all. He caught each one before they hit the floor and lowered them against the wall with more care than the situation required. Some line he was still navigating. He noted the observation and moved on. The lift guard was looking the wrong direction, a mistake born of months of nothing happening. He had time to turn and register the shape of what was standing before Vader's hand closed on his collar and the wall decided the matter. The interior guard was better than the others. He was positioned correctly, with cover and sight lines, his hand already on his weapon when Vader came through the door. He fired twice. The second shot connected center mass, and the frick plating took it with a sound like a hammer finding an anvil, a sharp ringing impact that drove Vader back half a step and left a scorch across the chest rig. Vader closed the distance before the third shot formed. He used his hands and the Force, and the guard went down breathing, undamaged beyond what several days of soreness would account for. Vader stood in the center of Darrow Fenn's living room and let his breathing return to its measured rhythm. The apartment was expensive in the way of people who had money long enough to develop specific tastes. Real art on the walls. A viewport looking across the Senate District's spires with the unearned confidence of a man who believed his view of the Republic conferred understanding of it. A sound from the bedroom. A person deciding. "Don't calm," Vader said. The vocoder rendered it flat and resonant, filling the room. "Come out instead." Darrow Fenn appeared in the bedroom doorway, older than his official images suggested, soft in the way comfortable decades made men soft, wearing the expression of someone whose threat assessment training was losing a battle with the evidence in front of him. His eyes moved from the unconscious guard to the mask to the scorch on the chest rig. "You're not Jedi," Fenn said. "No." "Republic intelligence? No, what do you want?" "A conversation," Vader said. "About secondary ledgers. About routing protocols. About a man you've been serving for 11 years who doesn't know your name without a file in front of him." Something moved through Fenn's expression, the quality of a man who has been waiting for a knock on the door for a very long time and has never quite worked out what to feel when it finally comes. Not surprise. The grim, exhausted recognition of an ending. "He'll know," Fenn said. "When I'm gone, he'll know someone found the ledger. Yes, he will. Then you understand, this doesn't stop anything. I'm one piece. You're the piece that funds the parts of the war that can't be funded officially," Vader said. "Without your routing chain, he operates on visible money, traceable money, money that moves through channels with oversight. He becomes smaller. Everything he's built becomes smaller." Fenn looked at him for a long moment. Then, with the strange dignity of a man arranging his final account, "I want you to know that I knew what I was doing. I won't tell you I didn't know. I knew. I know you knew," Vader said. He drew the blade. The red light filled the room, different from blue, different from green. Harsher, more honest about what it was for. Fenn looked at the blade, and then at Vader, and did not plead, which Anakin noted with something occupying the territory near respect. The man had his accounting straight, at least. Sidious doesn't waste grief on his tools, Vader said. Neither will I. Afterward, he stood in the apartment's silence and let the weight of what had just happened settle into him without trying to make it lighter than it was. He had crossed something. He understood that. He had spent his entire life being told by people he respected that this crossing was the beginning of a road with only one destination, and he believed them, and he was doing it anyway. He moved to the primary terminal and spent several minutes downloading the complete secondary ledger to a fresh data spike. Evidence, properly encrypted, for a day when evidence would matter more than it did right now. Then he took a vibro-etch stylus from his harness and scored the wall above the terminal. A glyph. Orbesh characters in a stylized angular form he'd designed specifically for this. Not any existing Sith sigil, not anything traceable to known dark side iconography. Something new. A mark that said, there is something in this galaxy hunting you, and it has been here, and it will come again. He stood back and looked at it. Then he went out the way he'd come, over the parapet and down the east face, the city sprawling below. Indifferent and endless, and entirely unaware of what had just changed inside one of its highest towers. By the time General Anakin Skywalker stood at the head of a briefing table in the Jedi Temple's war room the following morning, walking 12 Jedi Knights through updated intelligence on separatist fleet movements, he had not slept. He didn't look like it. The war had given him that, the ability to function at the surface with complete competence while something else ran underneath, parallel and separate, like two rivers occupying the same channel without mixing. He answered questions. He reviewed tactical overlays. He disagreed with a senior knight's assessment of the Bothawui approach vector and was proven right by the map within 90 seconds. Master Plo Koon, seated at the far end of the table, watched him with the attentive stillness of someone sensing something they couldn't name. Anakin met his gaze once, briefly, and smiled the easy, confident smile of a man who had nothing to report. Master Plo looked away. Anakin looked back at the tactical overlay, and in the river that ran underneath everything, cold and dark and entirely purposeful, he was already building the next operation. Palpatine received word before his morning aid arrived. The message described the discovery of Darrow Fenn's body, an unconscious private security detail, and a scorched mark above the primary terminal that the investigating officers had photographed and were unable to identify. He read it twice. Then he set the datapad face down on his desk and sat very still for a long moment. This was not a thing he did often. Stillness, for Palpatine, was always performed, the contemplative pause of a beloved elder statesman, deployed for effect. This stillness was different. This was the stillness of a man running calculations he did not want to reach the end of, because the end of them led somewhere that disrupted 60 years of certainty. He did not recognize the glyph. That was the thing that sat incorrectly in the machinery of his thinking. He had spent decades cataloging every known dark side sigil, every Sith cult's iconography, every Fringe Order's territorial symbol that had surfaced in the underworld in the past century. He knew them all. The mark on Fenn's wall belonged to none of them. It was new, deliberate, designed to be found. Someone was introducing themselves. When the hologram of Count Dooku resolved, blue-white and precise, the composed aristocratic face that had never in 30 years of association allowed Palpatine to see anything Dooku hadn't chosen to put there. It was the quality of Dooku's composure that told the full story. Today it had the quality of something maintained through effort rather than ease. "You've seen the report," Palpatine said. "Within the hour." Fenn was careful. Whatever found him was more careful. "The mark," Palpatine said. "Unknown to me. I've checked it against every Sith artifact database I can access. Nothing, it was invented for this purpose. It's a statement, someone informing us they exist and that they chose their target with precision. A rival, then, someone with resources and an agenda that overlaps with ours. No, Palpatine said. The word came out flat. Dooku stopped. Fen served one agenda. Mine, his death serves one purpose, disrupting the private financing. This is someone who understands the architecture, specifically enough to know that Fen existed at all. Something behind Dooku's eyes performed a rapid, private recalculation that Palpatine clocked with the ease of long familiarity. Dooku was reassessing his own exposure. Dooku was, for the first time in some years, genuinely uncertain. Good, Palpatine thought. That makes two of us. Accelerate the Outer Rim offensive. Pull additional fleets forward on the Bothawui corridor. I want the Jedi stretched across too many fronts to pull anyone back for internal investigations. That will cost a month of campaign timeline. Do it anyway, Palpatine said, and ended the transmission. He sat alone in his office with the photograph of an unknown glyph on the desk and opened a new file on his private terminal, labeled it with a single question mark, and began to fill it with everything he knew about the death of Darrow Fen. Which was very little, and everything he could deduce from that little. Which was slightly more and considerably more alarming. Anakin arrived for their private meeting with the easy, unguarded manner he'd always brought to these appointments, slightly early, posture open, something light said about the Bothawui briefing. He sat across from Palpatine's desk with his elbows on his knees and his face warm and present, and Palpatine watched him with the full depth of 60 years of reading people and found, as he had always found, a young man who appeared to be exactly what he appeared to be. Warm, turbulent, trusting, in the specific way of someone who had learned to direct trust toward particular people and did so completely. Palpatine returned the warmth. He was very good at that. You look tired, my boy, he said. The Outer Rim campaigns. The Council wants simultaneous pushes on 3 fronts. Someone has to actually win the war. Indeed, a beat. I heard something troubling this morning. A banking clan liaison, a man named Fen, was found dead in his penthouse. Security detail neutralized. He watched Anakin's face. Nothing. A small furrow of concern. Appropriate and appropriately timed. Assassination? It appears so. There was a mark left at the scene. None of our investigators recognize it. He tilted his head slightly. What concerns me is the target. Fen was not a public figure. Finding him required knowledge that very few people possess. An inside source, Anakin said. The voice of a soldier asking a tactical question. Or an intercept, Palpatine said. And let the words sit in the air. He watched for the micro-response, the fractional tension, the eyes moving wrong, the breath catching a quarter-second late. Anakin nodded slowly, with the measured consideration of a man thinking it through, someone with access to sensitive channels. Republic intelligence, maybe. Or Sith internal. Or Jedi intelligence networks, Palpatine said. Lightly, gently, Anakin looked at him with the direct, guileless expression of a man deciding whether to be offended by an implication. You think a Jedi did this? I think the Jedi have access to channels that most do not. I'm not suggesting anything, Anakin. I'm thinking aloud. He let his voice age slightly at its edges. I find I trust fewer people by the day. Anakin was quiet for a moment. Then, with the easy warmth of a man who had no reason to be otherwise, you can trust the Council, Chancellor, whatever's happening. The Order isn't behind it. Of course. Forgive an old man his nerves. He watched Anakin's face throughout, with every instrument at his disposal, and found nothing. Warmth, mild concern. The faint alertness of a soldier filing tactical information. It was a flawless performance. And something in that very flawlessness, some quality he couldn't immediately locate, a smoothness where he expected the usual slight roughness of genuine emotion, a completeness where Anakin had always left small, readable gaps, pressed against the edge of Palpatine's perception like a splinter he couldn't find. He had known Anakin Skywalker for 20 years. He knew the texture of this young man's emotional life, the way a craftsman knew his primary tool, every grain, every predictable response to every familiar pressure. Anakin's concern had always been slightly disorganized, spilling at the edges. His reassurance had always carried the faint undertow of someone who was reassuring himself as much as the listener. His warmth was genuine, and genuine warmth was never perfectly calibrated. It ran a degree or two too hot or too cold depending on what he'd been thinking about, and Palpatine could always read what he'd been thinking about from the calibration. Now, it was exactly right. Precisely correct. The warmth of a man who had nothing on his mind beyond what he'd said. No undertow, no spillage at the edges. Something was different. He could not point to a single thing. He could not produce the evidence in any form that would satisfy a rigorous examiner. But he had spent 60 years making his living on exactly this kind of reading, and the reading was telling him something he very much did not want it to say. After Anakin left, Palpatine opened the question mark file and added a single line at the bottom, cross-reference, Skywalker. He left it there. He did not delete it. He did not yet act on it. But somewhere beneath his composure, in the cold engineered depths of a mind that had spent 60 years containing everything that might be used against him, something that was not quite fear had taken its first careful breath. The battle for Saleucami had been running for nearly 2 weeks when Anakin disappeared. Not dramatically, not in the way that generated immediate alarm. He was present at the pre-dawn briefing aboard the Resolute, accounted for during a perimeter check on the southern landing zone, and then absent when Captain Rux went to find him for the mid-morning tactical update. Rux reported it to Obi-Wan with the careful phrasing of a soldier who had served under Anakin Skywalker for 4 years and had developed strong opinions about the distinction between missing and doing something he hasn't told anyone about yet. He's not in the field, General. His fighter is still on the pad. His comlink is going to static. Last tracker reading put him at the Eastern Ridge 2 hours ago, and then nothing. Obi-Wan looked at the tactical map and felt the specific concern that Anakin had always generated in him, not the sharp fear of genuine danger, but the worn and unease of a man whose former apprentice had been finding creative ways to complicate his life for the better part of a decade. "He's not dead," Obi-Wan said. He knew this the way he knew things through the Force, not as information, but as the absence of what would feel different if it weren't true. Then he's somewhere he didn't want to be tracked to. Expand the perimeter rotation. Don't log this as a missing persons report yet. And if someone asks, tell them General Skywalker is conducting a solo reconnaissance of the ridge approach, Obi-Wan said, which may even be true. It was not true. Anakin had left the Eastern Ridge before the search began. Via a pre-positioned single-person shuttle arranged 3 weeks earlier, a civilian transport, registered to a fictional agricultural concern, prepped by a droid he'd wiped clean after the mission. The shuttle was already in hyperspace before anyone started looking. He had 41 hours. The math was tight. Dooku was currently aboard General Grievous's flagship, the Invisible Hand, a Providence-class carrier/destroyer holding at the edge of the Saleucami system's outer belt in what the Sith believed was a secure position 6 hours from his departure point. Infiltration, engagement, and extraction would require 12 to 16 hours depending on variables he couldn't control. The window to arrive back on Saleucami before his absence generated unmanageable reports was 41 hours from departure. He'd planned for 38. The 3-hour buffer was not comfort. It was arithmetic. In the shuttle's cramped cockpit, he assembled the full armor in the dark, by feel, the way he'd been training himself to do it, each piece in sequence, each seal checked by hand. The HUD boot sequence verified. The red blade he ignited once, briefly, 3 seconds. He extinguished it. He sat in the dark in the full armor and breathed through the vocoder and thought about Dooku. Jan Dooku, Count of Sereno, former Jedi Master. A man whose lightsaber technique Obi-Wan had described after Geonosis as the finest he'd encountered. And Obi-Wan's assessments of combat skill were not given to exaggeration. A man who had trained Qui-Gon Jinn, which meant that somewhere in the chain of instruction that had shaped what Anakin was, Dooku's influence was present several links back. A man who had chosen the darkness and refined it across decades, who had played the war's villain while serving one half of a mechanism whose other half would have destroyed him eventually. He thought about this with the cold, precise attention of someone taking inventory of a problem. Then he thought about clean, surgical, and total, and the inventory was complete. The shuttle ran on through the dark. The invisible hand was an angular, aggressive shape against the stars, Grievous's ship in every sense, built around the philosophy that sufficient firepower made tactical subtlety unnecessary. Its internal security was comprehensive: overlapping droid patrols, camera coverage, automated threat response systems capable of locking down individual sections in under 4 seconds. All of it designed to stop things coming from outside. The maintenance shaft on the ship's ventral surface, a legacy design flaw in this class of carrier-destroyer. Documented in a Republic intelligence brief that Anakin had committed to memory, ran from the outer hull directly to the central power distribution deck, bypassing most of the ship's internal security checkpoints. He was inside before the first patrol cycle completed. Dooku's private strategy room was in the ship's upper third, connected by a private lift that didn't appear on the standard crew manifest. Anakin knew about the private lift because Obi-Wan had mentioned it once, offhand, after Geonosis, a character observation about Dooku's consistent preference for separating his personal operations from the droid commanders he nominally worked alongside. Obi-Wan had filed it as a personality note. Anakin had filed it as structural fact. He moved through the maintenance corridors with the unhurried patience he'd been developing over the past months, not the impatient forward drive that had always been his natural combat mode, but something slower and more absolute. He was not rushing toward a fight. He was moving toward a conclusion. The private lift responded to a bypass. He took it up. Dooku was in the strategy room. Anakin felt him before the lift doors opened, the old man's force presence like cold smoke, vast and disciplined and carrying the specific quality of dark side refinement that came from decades of deliberate cultivation. Genuinely, formidably powerful. And beneath the power, the accumulated weight of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had learned to carry it so well he'd stopped distinguishing it from himself. The doors opened. Dooku turned. He was in full formal dress, the dark cloak, the bearing that had never once in his life relaxed below a certain baseline of deliberate dignity. He looked at the armored figure in his doorway with the expression of a man encountering data that doesn't fit existing models. Not shock, not fear, but rapid, precise reassessment. "Interesting," Dooku said. His hand moved to his curved hilt. Both blades came up simultaneously. Dooku's red, Vader's red, and the room's strategy displays cast everything in competing light. Blue from the holographic maps, red from both sabers finding each other across the space between them. "You're not separatist," Dooku said, reading the armor, reading the blade, reading everything available. "And you're not Jedi." A pause of perhaps 1 second. "What are you?" Vader said nothing. He moved. This was the thing Dooku hadn't prepared for. Not the power, which was evident from the first exchange, but the style. He had dueled Obi-Wan before, had faced Anakin, and had cultivated precise models of what a Jedi attack felt like. The forms, the tells, the deep structural habits that even the finest practitioners couldn't fully suppress because they'd been installed too early and run too deep. He had counters for all of it. There were no Jedi tells in what came at him, not Form V's aggressive power-seeking, not Form 3's defensive cycling, not anything that corresponded to a pattern he could name, because Vader didn't fight from a form. He fought from conclusions. each move already the final move required, no preamble, no exploration, the vocabulary of a man who has decided the outcome and is simply arriving at it. Dooku was extraordinary. Anakin had known this, and still found the reality of it demanding everything. Every fragment of speed, every particle of force awareness that let him feel Dooku's intention shifting before it became action. Form 2 at its highest expression, the curved blade finding angles that shouldn't have existed, footwork so precise it seemed less like movement, and more like the room rearranging itself around him. He held it through exchange after exchange, pressing Dooku back toward the viewport. He felt the old man recalibrate, abandoning the initial read, building a new one. And the new one was faster and more dangerous, because Dooku had stopped underestimating. At the 7th exchange, Dooku landed a strike across the left pauldron. The frick plating held. A deep score, the smell of heated metal, a sound like something being decided, and the armor held. Dooku registered this. A fraction of a second. The fraction in which a man who has relied on a particular tool for 60 years discovers the tool may not be sufficient, and the recognition moves across his face before his composure can catch it. Vader stepped inside the next strike. One hand closed on Dooku's blade arm at the wrist. The force closed around the old man like weather. Not quick, not aggressive. The overwhelming indifferent pressure of something that had decided and was not interested in debate. Dooku fought it. He was strong enough that fighting it was not immediately pointless. Anakin felt the resistance, genuine and impressive. The dark side pushing back with the full weight of a master's life's work. He pushed harder. Dooku went to one knee. The curved blade extinguished as the wrist torqued past the angle that kept it viable. The old man looked up at the featureless black mask from a position he had not occupied in 40 years, and something moved across his face that Anakin had never expected to see there. Genuine fear. Not of death, Dooku had made his peace with death the way men of his philosophy did, as a passage beneath concern. What moved across his face was more specific, the fear of having been wrong. Of having spent 30 years of craft and cultivation on a master and a plan and a destiny, and of meeting, in his final minutes, evidence that the plan had contained an error he'd never been permitted to see. "Who are you?" Dooku said. Not a demand, something quieter and more honest. Vader looked at him through the HUD. He had planned to say nothing, but Dooku's face, looking up at him, held something he hadn't anticipated. Not the cruelty of Sith confidence, not composed aristocratic remove, but the face of someone who was, finally, asking a real question. Someone who saw the plan, Vader said. All of it. Start to finish. Something moved through the old man. Then you know that my master, yes, Vader said. A long silence. The holographic maps of the Salukami system turned in blue light. Indifferent. He would have destroyed me eventually, Dooku said. It was the sound of a man arriving at something he'd always known and had spent decades not arriving at. Yes, Vader said again. Dooku closed his eyes. He did not fight the end of it. That was what Anakin carried out of that room. Not the fight itself, but those final seconds. A man who had given his life to a darkness that had always intended to consume him, arriving at last at the simple, terrible arithmetic of it, and choosing to stop. The red blade came down once. Clean, final, Vader stood in the silence and breathed, and let the weight of what he'd done settle into him without trying to manage it. He had killed a Jedi Master. He had killed a man who had trained the man who trained him. He had killed someone who, in his last seconds, had perhaps been more honest about his situation than he'd been in 30 years. He thought about Obi-Wan, about the way Obi-Wan had described Dooku's saber technique after Geonosis, the specific, almost reverent quality of one great practitioner acknowledging another. He thought about Qui-Gon, who had died not knowing that the man who shaped him had already been lost to the dark. He thought about the long chain of it, the way darkness moved through people across generations, teaching what it knew. He thought about what he was, right now, in this room with a red blade and a dead man. He thought about what he was going to do with that. He stood with all of it for exactly as long as it took to know what he felt, and that he was going to carry it anyway. Then, he moved to the strategy room's secondary terminal and wiped the sensor logs with the focused efficiency of someone who had planned this part as carefully as the rest. The room's holographic maps continued their slow rotation overhead, Salukami and its moons, the outer belt where the ship currently held, the broader theater of a war that was, piece by piece, running out of the architecture that had been keeping it in motion. Then he moved. Obi-Wan found him that evening, precisely where the fabricated cover story required, slumped against the eastern ridge's rock face, armor-dusty, a convincing laceration across the left arm that Vader had made himself before ditching the black armor in the shuttle's concealed hold. Anakin? Obi-Wan was on one knee beside him in seconds, hands moving to the injury with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this too many times. What happened? We've had search teams on the ridge for hours, Scout Droid Patrol, Anakin said, his own voice warm and rough with manufactured exhaustion, bigger than the intelligence brief suggested. I went to ground when the comlink took a hit. He let his head fall back against the rock. Tell Rux the eastern approach has more droid units than the maps show. Obi-Wan looked at him for a long moment with the attentive stillness of a man who had known Anakin Skywalker for 15 years and had spent most of them learning to read the gap between what Anakin said and what Anakin meant. You're all right, Obi-Wan said. Not quite a question. The question underneath the statement. I'm fine, Anakin said, and met his former master's eyes with the steady open regard of a man who had nothing to report. Obi-Wan held the look for a long moment. Then he nodded and helped Anakin to his feet and said something about getting the arm looked at before the evening briefing. They walked back toward the camp together in the Salukami dusk, and Anakin listened to Obi-Wan talk about the day's developments, and underneath the listening, in the cold, purposeful place that ran parallel to everything, he was already thinking about what came next. Somewhere in the Separatist command network, a ship was drifting with a dead man in its strategy room. By morning, the galaxy would know that Count Dooku was gone. By evening, Palpatine would know the walls were closing. The Salukami wind moved through the ridge grass and said nothing about any of it, and Anakin walked in the dusk beside the man who trusted him most in the world, and felt the weight of all of it, and did not put it down. The emergency council session convened 2 days after the invisible hand was found drifting in the Salukami outer belt by a Republic salvage unit. 12 seats, full attendance, the morning light coming through the chamber's high windows at the low winter angle that made everything look both illuminated and cold. Anakin gave his report on the Salukami campaign and did not think about the last time he'd been in this room and what he'd been carrying. Master Windu spoke first, after the campaign report was acknowledged. The matter of Dooku's death. Execution, Master Plo Koon said. The precision of it, one strike, the room otherwise undisturbed. Someone came specifically for him. The mark, Ki-Adi-Mundi said. The same glyph reported at the Fen scene on Coruscant. Anakin watched the Masters work through it, the banking clan connection, the methodical nature of both operations, the question of what connected a separatist figurehead and a financial intermediary beyond the Sith. He watched them come close to the answer and not arrive at it. Power, Windu said finally. Someone is dismantling the infrastructure beneath the war, the funding, the figureheads, like they know something about how the war actually runs that the public record doesn't show. He turned to Anakin. Skywalker, your read? Anakin let himself consider it for the appropriate length of time. Whoever it is, they're not trying to stop the war. If they were, they'd target the Senate or the clone army's command structure. They're targeting the machinery underneath, like they know things about how the war is actually being run. He paused. That's a narrow category of knowledge. Yes, Ki-Adi-Mundi agreed. It is. He held Windu's gaze with the easy steadiness of a man who had just made a true observation that pointed directly at himself from the outside, and felt the specific hollow quality of an irony too large to safely notice. Yoda spoke at the end, with the quality of attention that wasn't directed at the room, but through it. Assign this investigation. We must. A Jedi-led task force, with full access to Republic security networks. The right Jedi, sensitive to dark side fluctuations, capable of operating across multiple jurisdictions. He had said nothing else during the preceding analysis and debate. He had sat with his eyes half closed and his Geimer stick between his hands and the quality of attention that wasn't directed at the room, but through it, towards something the room was only imperfectly representing. Anakin had watched him throughout the session with the particular attention he always gave to Yoda. The attention of someone who knew that the old master's silences were usually more informative than other people's speeches. At the end of the briefing, as the other council members gathered their datapads and began moving toward the doors, Yoda had looked at Anakin directly. Just for a moment. Just the dark eyes and the quality of attention behind them. A look that contained something between inquiry and recognition, and then was simply over, replaced by the neutral, present regard Yoda gave to everything equally. Anakin had held the look steadily and felt nothing behind it move. Master Skywalker, Windu said, you have the intelligence relationships, the cross-jurisdiction clearances, and an aptitude for unconventional operational thinking. Anakin looked at Mace Windu. He felt, briefly and with some clarity, that the galaxy had a sense of humor he was in no position to appreciate. I'll take it, he said. The task force met for the first time that afternoon. Anakin, 2 senior Jedi Knights whose competence and discretion he'd worked with before, and a Republic intelligence liaison named Pharaoh, who had the lean, skeptical quality of a man who had spent 15 years learning not to be surprised, and was still occasionally surprised. Anakin ran the briefing with focused efficiency. He assigned Jedi Cyril to Fenn's ledger trail, with parameters calibrated to produce genuine investigative work, while ensuring the full routing chain would require another 4 to 6 weeks to complete. He assigned Jedi Orvin to the Invisible Hand forensic team, tasked with reconstructing an infiltration timeline built on evidence that pointed toward the wrong section of the ship entirely. After the briefing, Pharaoh lingered. You're moving the Fenn investigation slow, Pharaoh said. A professional observation. I'm moving it correctly, Anakin said. Fast investigations on financial forensics produce incomplete pictures. Cyril needs the full ledger tree before we start following branches. Pharaoh filed this away. Fair enough, he said, and left. Anakin sat in the empty briefing room and looked at the caseboard he'd constructed, his own name at the center of it, in the negative space, invisible and load-bearing, and felt something that was not pride and was not amusement, and occupied a strange airless territory between them. Ahsoka found him that evening. She had a gift for this, for arriving at exactly the moment when solitude became the problem rather than the solution. She dropped into the chair across from him with the easy physicality that had always characterized her, and looked at the caseboard with bright, interested eyes. The Rogue Sith Task Force, she said. I heard you took the lead. Someone had to, Anakin said. She was 16, and had about her the quality of someone who had been through enough that the youthful surface and the experienced interior existed in layers rather than contradiction. I'm proud of you, she said simply. Taking this seriously. Half the council wanted to hand it to intelligence and file it under cis internal conflict. That would have been wrong, Anakin said. I know. That's why I'm proud of you. She looked at the caseboard. The Fenn ledger, if that routing chain is as deep as Cyril thinks, someone took it for a reason beyond cutting off funds. They took it as a record, evidence, building a case rather than just disrupting operations, like they're planning to use it eventually. Anakin went very still for exactly 1 second. Then, that's a good read. She looked at him for a moment with the particular attention of someone who had learned to hear the small off notes in a person whose instrument she knew well. "You okay?" "Tired," he said. Salukami was a long campaign. She held the look for a moment. Then she nodded, said something about getting food before the evening watch rotation, and left him to it. After she was gone, Anakin sat in the quiet room and felt the particular exhaustion of performing himself for people who loved him, and breathed through it, and did not allow it to become self-pity. Self-pity was a luxury with a cost he couldn't afford. He went to Padme that night. Not as Vader, he hadn't been to her as Vader since the operation began. He came in Jedi robes, through the private entrance Dorm had arranged, and Padme looked up from the Senate brief she was reading, and said nothing for a moment. She could always tell. Not what, exactly, she didn't know about the armor or the missions or any of the specifics. And he'd kept all of that from her, with the deliberate care of someone who understood that knowledge was exposure. But she knew him. She had learned the particular quality of the weight he arrived with when it was real rather than routine. She put down the brief. She crossed the room and put her hand against the side of his face, and he closed his eyes, and something in the deep, cold places that had been running for months went quiet. Not gone. He didn't pretend gone. But quiet. "How bad?" she asked. "Manageable," he said. She looked at him with the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had learned to distinguish between manageable meaning fine and manageable meaning being held together by the decision to keep holding. She didn't push. She trusted the thing underneath all of it, the thing that had been consistent even when everything else hadn't. "Stay," she said. He stayed. In the temple, the task force case board held its careful construction of misdirection and partial truth. In Palpatine's office, the question mark file grew another line of notation, and in Padme's apartment, for a few hours, Anakin Skywalker was just himself, the real one, underneath everything he'd built around it, and that was enough to carry him to morning. The intelligence pointing toward Kamino came through Cyril's ledger work, buried in a payment routing chain that Cyril himself didn't yet understand. Anakin found it late one night, alone in the briefing room with the case files spread across 3 datapads. A payment routed from a shell corporation to a Kaminoan biological research account. Not a standing contract, but a completion payment. Made over a year earlier for services under a project reference code that appeared nowhere in any public Kaminoan registry. He cross-referenced it against the fragment from Palpatine's transmission. The phrase inhibitor protocol sat in his memory with the clarity of things burned in rather than learned. He sat with both pieces of information for 4 minutes. Then he began building the Kamino operation. He told Rux he was taking field leave. Rux received this with the expression of a man who had long ago made peace with the fictional nature of his commanding officer's relationship with that concept, and said yes, sir, in a tone that communicated he would maintain his own private readiness regardless. The cover for the council was a meditation retreat, one of the temple's recognized practices for senior Jedi, dealing with sustained combat stress, requiring no check-ins and generating no location logs by design. Anakin arranged for a room in the retreat wing to be occupied by a specific sequence of droid activity that would produce biosensor readings consistent with a meditating human. He'd built the protocol himself. It would hold for 12 days. He needed 9. Kamino from approach looked like a world that had committed entirely to a single opinion. Water in every direction and register, ocean below, cloud cover above, and between them the driving horizontal rain that never paused and never changed its mind. The cloning spires rose from the surface like arguments against the weather, white and vertical and insisting on their own existence. Vader came in on the ventral approach, below the main traffic corridors, in a ship transponder coded as a routine supply run. He'd acquired the code through the task force's intelligence access, a genuine code, flagged as en route in the Port Authority's scheduling software via a brief intrusion. Kamino's security was comprehensive and almost entirely automated, calibrated against external threats, unauthorized arrivals, Sith infiltration. None of it was calibrated against a Force-sensitive and chameleon weave armor who had studied the facility's security architecture from intelligence files and was, as of 3 weeks ago, the lead Jedi investigator on a task force with full access to Republic security network documentation. He moved through the landing bay's outer corridor without triggering a single alert. The stealth field bending the optical sensors' read on him into nothing. The internal geography of Tipoca City he'd reconstructed from the Republic's cloning program documentation. Dense technical reading he'd consumed in one sitting and retained not as memorization, but as understanding of the logic that produced the arrangement. The Biometric Research Division, responsible for the inhibitor chip's biological specification, was labeled in the facility documentation as Advanced Integration Systems, with the bland specificity of a name designed not to prompt questions. He found the mainframe terminal in the wing's central operations room before the first patrol cycle repeated. The Kaminoan administrator was named Nala Se. He knew her from Cyril's ledger work, the signatory on the completion payment, the authorization that had closed the inhibitor chip project's final accounting. She was at her workstation when he came through the door. Her reaction was controlled in the Kaminoan way, a stillness so complete it looked like nothing from the outside but registered to Anakin's Force sense as a rapid cascade of physiological response carefully suppressed. She turned slowly. She looked at the armored figure in her doorway with the large, dark eyes of her species. And then she looked down at her workstation. A small motion, something put away or turned off. The specific gesture of a person who has been waiting to be found and has spent the waiting time deciding what they would do when it happened. He knew her file. He knew about the clone trooper who had discovered the chips and been silenced, and he knew that Nala Se had been the mechanism of that silencing. She had known what the chips were for and had protected the program and suppressed the truth. That history sat between them in the room as a fact that neither of them acknowledged, and neither of them could ignore. She had the look of someone who had spent a long time deciding whether what she had done could be answered for, and had arrived, recently, at a conclusion. "You know why I'm here," Vader said. A pause. The chip protocol. All of it. The specification, the activation architecture, every backup trigger in the system. I need access to the mainframe, and I need you to walk me through the deactivation sequence. Nala Se was quiet for a long moment. "You're not here to destroy the facility. No, I'm here to remove a device from the Army's architecture that turns soldiers into weapons against their own commanders on a coded signal. That's all." She looked at him. "The Jedi Council doesn't know you're here." "No, but you're acting to protect them." Vader said nothing. She turned back to her workstation. "The activation sequence is embedded in the biochip's tertiary neural pathway," she said, with the precise professionalism of someone who had made a decision and was implementing it without further deliberation. "It responds to a specific encoded transmission. Removing it from active chips requires individual surgical procedures, not possible at scale. Corrupting the transmission protocol centrally prevents activation without physical modification. Show me. It took 4 hours." Nala Se worked the mainframe with the efficiency of someone who had built the system and knew every seam. Anakin worked beside her, not as an observer but as a participant, understanding the architecture well enough by the second hour to anticipate the next sequence before she named it. He had his hands in the code the way he had his hands in an engine, comprehending it at a level below the interface. When a facility supervisor came to check, Nala Se said long cycle diagnostic. The integration metrics flagged an anomaly in batch 7 alpha. "I'm running a full protocol check, without pausing or turning, and the supervisor looked at the workstation for 2 seconds, said report when complete, and left." After the door closed, Anakin let out a breath he hadn't been aware of holding. "You do this well," he said. "I've had practice," Nala Se said quietly at not saying things. A pause that contained everything her file contained. This is the first time I've said them. He thought about that and found he had nothing to add. When the corruption sequence completed and Nala Se ran the verification twice, both passes confirmed the same result. The Order 66 transmission protocol, corrupted at the broadcast level, would now produce nothing receivable. Every chip in every clone in the Grand Army of the Republic was deaf. Anakin stood in the center of the operations room and felt something quieter than relief, and quieter than triumph. The specific weight of a thing that had needed to be done, and was now done. Complete, irrevocable, existing in the world as fact rather than plan. He thought about Captain Rux. About every face in the 501st. About hundreds of thousands of men who had no idea that their lives had just been quietly, permanently altered by a decision they would never be told was made. He crossed to the growth chamber observation window and looked down at rows of tanks, hundreds of them, each containing a clone in some stage of development. Men who hadn't been born yet, men who would never carry a death sentence in their skull's architecture. He stood there for a while. Outside, the Camino rain drove against the facility's exterior in long silver curtains, the way it always drove on this world, without pause, without variation, the atmosphere insisting on itself with the patient total commitment of something that had always been this way and expected to continue. It made no distinction between what mattered and what didn't. It fell on the spires and the tanks and the observation window with equal, indifferent persistence. The men in those tanks would never know this day had happened. They would never know the name Vader. They would never know that someone had come here in the dark and argued with the architecture of their deaths and won. They would simply be born and train and serve and go home, or not go home, because war was still war, but they would do it without a kill switch seated behind their eyes. The protection was real, and the anonymity of it was absolute. That was the part of this that had no ceremony, no acknowledgement, no witness. That was the part he was going to have to carry in the place where most people carried the things that had been recognized. He had not done this for recognition. He took the mask off. Just for a moment. Just to be Anakin Skywalker in this room, looking at what Anakin Skywalker had done, without the filter of everything he'd built around it. He looked like himself. He felt like himself. Both versions. The Jedi general who loved his men, and the shadow that had spent months dismantling the machinery of their scheduled deaths. He put the mask back on. "The ledger payment record," he said. "I need it certified as evidence. Your digital signature on the original authorization document, time-stamped. You're building a case," she said. "Several," he said. She certified it without further comment. The professionalism of someone who had made her decision and was seeing it through cleanly. He was back in the landing bay within the hour, in hyperspace not long after. 9 days. 6 remaining. He sat in the cockpit without the mask and let himself feel the full weight of what the past months had been, not to examine it, not to process it into something manageable, but just to let it be as large as it actually was. Then he set course for Coruscant. One more piece, one more, and then the end of it. Palpatine had not slept properly in weeks. The specific quality of his thinking had developed a roughness he recognized and disliked, a tendency to return to calculations he'd already completed, checking them again not because they'd changed, but because the results were unacceptable and some part of him kept hoping the arithmetic would revise itself. It did not revise itself. The banking clan financier was dead. Count Dooku was dead. A relic broker named Veth Sorn had vanished from his established haunts, an absence the question mark file now treated as a probable casualty rather than coincidence. And the clone army, 3 private test transmissions through the Order 66 broadcast protocol, had produced no response in a small monitoring group positioned near Camino. The chips registered as present and functional. The broadcast found nothing to receive it. Someone had been to Camino. He sat with the question mark file and felt, with the clarity that came from removing the performance of calm, that patience was no longer viable. Someone had to be found. Someone had to be made to stop. The trap took 6 days to build and was, Palpatine acknowledged privately, among the best work of his career. The mechanism was simple. False intelligence, leaked through 3 channels that the task force's investigation would plausibly intercept, suggesting that a dark side gathering was scheduled at a disused power conversion facility deep in the city's infrastructure. The gathering was fictional. The location was not. He'd been using the conversion facility for private meetings for 11 years and knew its geometry in the dark, knew every entrance and exit and structural feature and sightline. He spent 2 preparation days positioning equipment, sensor dampeners, a shield generator, 4 trusted Senate Guard units in plainclothes, and a lighting array in the upper gallery that could illuminate the full floor in under 2 seconds on a wrist-mounted trigger. The intelligence was specific enough to draw out the unknown operative, not so specific as to read as fabricated. He released it and waited. Anakin found it the following morning. It surfaced in the task force's intelligence feed with a legitimate authentication trail that checked out 3 levels deep. He read it twice with Pharaoh beside him and felt the specific quality of a fabrication constructed by someone who understood exactly how authentication would be run and had built the false trail to satisfy it at every checkpoint. Someone very good had built this. He looked at the location and ran the assessment in the cold parallel channel. The facility was real. The atmospheric qualities were genuine. The operational logic of the intelligence was sound. And it was also, with a certainty he felt at bone level, a trap. Credible enough to act on, Anakin said. I want to run a preliminary scout before we commit the full task force. Low footprint, just me, with a support unit holding 2 levels up, ready to move on my signal. Pharaoh looked at him with the assessing expression of a man who had watched Anakin Skywalker operate for months and had developed a professional opinion of his judgment. Your call, Pharaoh said. It was his call. That was the thing Anakin had arranged, carefully and across several weeks, to be true. He went to the facility as Vader. The armor went on in the same sub-level storage unit he'd been using since the beginning, assembled in the dark by feel, the sequence so established it required no attention. He took the maintenance shaft network down to the facility level and came in through the ventral service entrance. The facility was large, a converted power distribution hub from an earlier era, all high ceilings and industrial scale, carrying the hollow, echoing quality of somewhere that hadn't been regularly used in a long time. His HUD read the space and thermal overlay, 4 distinct heat signatures positioned at the facility's 4 corners. Human, stationary, positioned to cover a specific central zone. He stopped in the shadows of the entrance corridor and assessed. And felt something else, a presence. Vast and old and cold and patient, the specific quality of dark side cultivation at its highest expression, larger and older than anything Dooku had achieved. The signature of something that had been refining itself for decades beyond any practitioner Anakin had encountered. He knew this presence. He had known it his whole life. Had felt it every time he sat across a desk from a beloved elder statesman who called him son. He had never felt it like this. Without the performance. Without the warmth and the paternal comfort and 60 years of practiced concealment. Just the thing itself, present and enormous and absolutely certain of itself, waiting in the room ahead. Palpatine knew. The thought arrived clean and complete. Not a shock, but the confirmation of something the parallel channel had been calculating since he'd read the intelligence report. The trap was not for an unknown operative. The question mark file had resolved. The trap was for Anakin Skywalker. He could leave. The math was straightforward. Withdraw, file the empty facility report. Continue through other approaches. The endgame was close enough that caution was arithmetically superior. He thought about Padam, about Ahsoka, about Rux and the 501st, and every clone in the GAR with a chip that was now permanently silent. He thought about the boy's usefulness and the flat certainty of a man doing accounting. He moved forward. At 35 meters, the lighting array fired. The facility went from dim to blazing in under 2 seconds, white light filling every corner, eliminating every shadow. Vader stopped in the center of the illuminated floor and did not raise his blade. From the gallery above, a figure descended, not quickly. With the measured pace of someone who had arranged all of this and was now arriving at the moment the arrangement had been built toward. Palpatine reached the floor level and stood 40 meters away and looked at the black armored figure, and for a moment neither of them moved. "I had a file," Palpatine said. His voice was the Chancellor's voice, carrying beneath it something not quite steady. A file with a question mark. "I've been adding to it for months." He looked at the mask. The file has a name now. He looked at the red blade that had not yet been drawn. "Take it off," Palpatine said. "I want to see you." Vader reached up. The mask came away. Anakin Skywalker stood in the light of the converted facility and looked across 40 meters of empty floor at the man who had spent 20 years learning the precise architecture of who he was, and said nothing. Palpatine looked at him for a long moment. Then something happened to his face that Anakin had never seen happen to it before. Every line of it dropped away, all at once. The practiced warmth, the composed authority, the beloved elder statesman construction that 60 years of discipline had made second nature, gone, like a structure that had been held up by the anticipation of a specific outcome and had encountered. Instead, the specific outcome it had been trying to prevent. What was underneath was old. Older than the warmth, older than the Chancellor, older than anything Anakin had been permitted to see. What was underneath was afraid. "You," Palpatine said. Just the word, landing with the weight of everything it meant. Anakin looked at him across the empty space and felt the cold place settle into absolute stillness. "Me," he said. Palpatine's composure closed again, not back to the Chancellor's warmth, which was gone, and they both understood it was gone, but into something older and more honest, assembled now for function rather than performance. The face of Darth Sidious, in full, without architecture. Not monstrous, that was the thing people who hadn't met real evil always got wrong, but remarkable for the sheer 60 years refined intelligence in it. The intelligence of a mind that had built the most complex political construction in galactic history and had been watching it come apart piece by piece for months, and was now, finally, looking at the hands that had been taking it apart. "How long?" Palpatine said. "Since Raxus." The relay station. You left an encrypted transmission on a comm buoy. A brief pause. The pause of a man absorbing information and calculating backward through its implications at speed. The cipher was Sith grade. It took me 2 hours. Something moved through Palpatine's expression. Professional acknowledgement of capability from a man with very high standards for what qualified as capable. "And you said nothing. For months. You sat across my desk. You were already running the operation." "Yes, the task force," Palpatine said. "You assigned yourself to investigate yourself. It gave me access to intelligence networks I needed, and kept the Council's investigation moving slowly enough to finish the work." Palpatine looked at him with the complete assessment of a man rereading something he thought he understood. "I had a cross-reference in the file. A suspicion I couldn't confirm. I very nearly acted on it several weeks ago." "I know," Anakin said. "You pulled my movement logs." "I noticed." A silence. "You noticed." Palpatine repeated. "You accessed the temple's external sensor archive through a Senate intelligence back channel. I'd flagged all activity through that channel as part of the task force's network monitoring. I gave you false logs." You were looking at a very boring stretch of General Skywalker attending briefings and sleeping. The silence this time had a different quality. The silence of a man who had spent 60 years being the most capable intelligence in every room he entered, encountering evidence that the room had, for months, contained something he'd failed to fully account for. Palpatine's hand moved. The shield generator activated. The guards began closing the geometry. Anakin ignited his blade. "Call them off." "I don't think so," Palpatine said. And his voice had completed its transition, fully Sidious now, the register that lived in the lower frequencies. The voice of something that had stopped performing for anyone. "You're extraordinary, Anakin, genuinely. But you're one man." "So are you," Anakin said. The lightning came. He'd prepared for this. That was the thing that made the difference. Not his speed or his force awareness, but the specific preparation of a man who had known this moment was coming, and had spent weeks thinking about what Sith lightning at full expression did to a human body, and what, precisely, the frick alloy plating was and wasn't capable of absorbing. He took the first strike on the chest rig. The impact drove him back 2 steps. A physical force beyond what the electrical component alone could account for. The dark side compressed into a kinetic delivery system. The frick plating held. He felt the heat of it through the synthweave base layer, and felt the lightning arc across the chest rig's surface, in a web of blue-white discharge before grounding out through his boots. The armor smoked. The score glowed orange at its edges. It held. He heard Palpatine register this, a sound, not a word, the involuntary response of a man whose primary weapon had failed to produce its expected result. Anakin pressed the reaction. Closing distance before the next strike formed, the guards reached him simultaneously from 3 directions. He took 2 seconds on the guards, the force throwing 2 of them clear, the third disarmed and down, and was already moving to deflect the second lightning strike, feeling the impact travel up his arms in a vibration that the frick joints distributed across his frame. Palpatine advanced. This was what Anakin hadn't fully modeled. The way Sidious moved when there was no performance requirement. Something older than the Chancellor. The Sith Lord in full commitment, and the commitment was extraordinary. The lightning came in combinations the temple archives noted had been recorded only twice in 2,000 years. He was inside the second combination when the 4th guard, the one he'd lost track of in the geometry, hit him from behind with a stun baton at the junction between the neck seal and the collar plate. The stun charge discharged into the base of his neck. He went to one knee. The blade stayed up. The arm remembered what it was doing even while the rest of him recalibrated. He swept the guard clear with a force push that he felt in his back teeth from the effort required, and got his other hand on the floor and pushed himself upright. Palpatine was 10 meters away, the lightning coiled between his fingers. Anakin looked at him through the HUD and reached into the Force the way he hadn't allowed himself to reach into it in months. Not in the cold managed channel, not in the controlled, compartmentalized way he'd been using it since Raxus. All of it. The full depth, the full burning brightness of his Force presence, without any of the architecture he'd built to contain it. The facility's ambient lighting flickered. The old converter housings groaned. Palpatine looked at what was coming and threw everything he had. The lightning and the Force met in the center of the space in a collision that Anakin felt in his bones. A pressure wave that cracked the floor between them, that blew the overhead lighting array into cascading sparks, that produced a sound like the air itself making a decision. Anakin was already moving through it. He moved the way he'd learned to move over months of operations, nothing the Jedi had installed, something that had grown from the particular combination of what he was and what he decided to be. He got inside the lightning, inside the range where it could be concentrated, and he felt it discharge across the armor's surface in the dispersed, grounded way the plating was designed for, distributed, not absorbed. and he raised the blade and brought it down in a single controlled arc at the hand that was generating it. Not the arm. The hand. Precise, surgical, Palpatine made a sound. The lightning cut off. He pulled back, and for the first time in the engagement he moved backward rather than forward, with the quality of something involuntary. Anakin stood between him and the facility's exit and breathed. Palpatine looked at him with the one thing Anakin had been waiting to see. Not fury, but the raw, genuine, unperformed face of a man who has run out of tools and knows it. 60 years, Palpatine said. His voice had lost its lower register authority, not through performance, but through the physiological reality of a man in pain, managing it with the same discipline he'd applied to everything else across a very long life. 60 years of construction. And you were 9 years old when I found you. I know, Anakin said. You could have come to me when you found the transmission. We could have. No, Anakin said. The word was flat, not angry, just complete. You needed me broken, Anakin said. That was always the architecture. Find the fracture points, widen them, turn them into doors you could open from the outside. Padam, Ahsoka, the war, the Council's failures, my mother. You were building a case for the darkness out of everything I loved and everything that hurt me, and you needed me not to see it clearly enough to refuse. He paused. I saw it. Palpatine looked at him. Something happened in the old man's face. Not breakdown, but a settling. The specific quality of a very old equation reaching its final balance. You should have been consumed, Palpatine said. By fear, by anger, by everything I gave you to work with. You should have been mine. Something in the words closer to perplexity than fury. How? Anakin thought about Padme's hand against his face. He thought about rooks signaling a flanking squad on nothing but a look. He thought about rows of clone tanks on Kamino and the weight of knowing they were safe. He thought about all the things he hadn't lost, all the fracture points that hadn't opened the way Palpatine had needed them to open, all the love that had held rather than festered. You needed us broken to win, he said. We were never broken. He raised the blade. One strike. Clean, decided. Palpatine did not look away. The facility went quiet. Anakin stood in the silence and the scorched light and felt the weight of 60 years of architecture settling into the ground like a structure that had stopped being held up, and he breathed through it. And he let it be as large as it was, and he did not try to make it anything other than what it was. Done. The blade went out. In the quiet, the old converter housings ticked as they cooled, and somewhere above this level the city went on in its indifferent, endless way, and Anakin Skywalker stood alone in the dark, with the red blade extinguished, and the mask in his hand, and the full weight of everything he'd become, and everything he'd prevented settling into him like a tide finding its level. He put the mask back on. He had a report to file. The war ended on a Thursday, not with a battle, with an absence. The Separatist command network, deprived of Dooku's coordinating intelligence and Palpatine's hidden strategic direction, had been running on institutional momentum for weeks, the way a machine runs after the hand operating it has been removed. It runs until the friction catches up. In the third week after the Level 1850 facility went quiet, the friction caught up. 7 Separatist systems filed simultaneous ceasefire requests through neutral diplomatic channels. Then 12 more, then the remainder, in a cascade that the HoloNet's political analysts would spend the next decade attempting to attribute to various economic and military factors that had nothing to do with what had actually happened. The clone army stood down across 40 star systems and did not kill anyone. Anakin sat in the temple's 4th floor briefing room and listened to the reports come in and felt nothing dramatic. Something quieter. The specific quality of a thing completed, the way the final piece of a mechanical assembly feels when it seats correctly and the whole system becomes what it was designed to be. He thought about a transmission from a Raxus relay station. He thought about Rux, somewhere in the Outer Rim, receiving orders to stand down and going home. He closed the task force caseboard, the investigation into the rogue Sith that had officially gone cold, a dark side operative who had conducted a targeted campaign against Republic-adjacent corruption. Origin unknown, whereabouts unknown, file status, open but inactive. He locked the terminal and left the room. The conversation with Obi-Wan happened 4 days later. They walked the temple's upper colonnades in the early morning, the Coruscant skyline spread below them in gray-gold overcast light. Obi-Wan walked with his hands behind his back and said nothing for the first several minutes. "Something has been different," Obi-Wan said finally. "For months." Anakin walked beside him. "Yes, you're not going to tell me what. Not a question. No, the war is over," Obi-Wan said. "Palpatine is dead," the official report says, a heart attack, which I find a pause, precise and characteristic. "Convenient, men of his age," Anakin said. Another moment. The rogue Sith task force produced no definitive leads. These things go cold. They do. Obi-Wan stopped walking. He looked at the skyline. There's a Jedi technique, very old, rarely practiced, for sensing whether a person's force signature has changed in fundamental ways. Not the surface turbulence we all carry, the deeper structure. He paused. "I've been considering whether to use it." Anakin said nothing. "I've decided not to," Obi-Wan said. The colonnades were quiet. Below, the city was beginning its morning, skylanes filling, the ordinary machinery of a galaxy that was, against the arithmetic of what it might have been, still intact. "Whatever you did," Obi-Wan said, "I want you to know that I trust the person who did it. Not blindly. Trust isn't blind when it's earned across 15 years. He was quiet for a moment. "I also want you to know that the things you're carrying don't have to be carried alone. Not permanently." Anakin looked at his former master's profile against the gray-gold morning light. The honest, decent face of the person who had taught him what it looked like to approach the world with integrity and maintain it under pressure. The person who had, across 15 years, managed to be wrong about him in specific ways and right about him in the ways that mattered more. He thought about Obi-Wan describing Dooku's Form 2 in a debrief, with that particular quality of admiration that Obi-Wan could never quite suppress when he encountered genuine excellence. He thought about Obi-Wan saying, "I don't think that would work," about plans that worked. He thought about Obi-Wan in the field, careful, steady, the kind of reliable that wasn't about caution, but about knowing himself well enough to always show up as the same person, whether the situation was calm or catastrophic. He thought about what it meant to have been trained by someone like that, and to have done what he'd done with the training. He thought about what it meant that Obi-Wan had already figured out there was something to figure out, and had chosen, deliberately, not to press it. Some forms of trust were louder than others. This one was very quiet and very large. "I know," Anakin said. "Not yet. But I know." Obi-Wan nodded once, the nod of a man choosing to accept what he's been given rather than press for what he hasn't, and said something about the morning briefing, and they walked on, and that was the conversation, and it was enough. He resigned from the Jedi Order on a Friday. The letter was 3 paragraphs, written over 4 evenings. He said he'd found, across the years of the war, that his path had diverged from the Order's in ways that were fundamental rather than correctable. He said the Order had given him everything that mattered about who he was, and that he was leaving it not in rejection, but in recognition that the shape of what he needed to be no longer fit inside its structure. He said he wished it well with the completeness of someone who meant it. He left the letter on Master Windu's desk before anyone was in the administrative wing. He was gone from the temple before the sun was fully up. Padam was awake when he arrived. She was at the viewport with a calf mug in both hands, looking at the Senate district spread below the way she always looked at it. Not because she needed to, but because it helped her think. She heard him come in through the private entrance and turned and looked at him. Civilian clothes. No Jedi robes, no armor, the face she'd always known, without any of the architecture around it. She looked at him for a long moment. "It's done," she said. "Yes," she set the mug down. She crossed the room and put both arms around him, and held on with the specific, unceremonious completeness of someone who has been waiting for a thing to be finished and is now simply glad it is. He put his face against her hair and breathed, and felt the full accumulated weight of everything he'd been carrying for months release into the quiet of her apartment like a tide going out. Not gone, he knew it wasn't gone, and didn't pretend otherwise, but held differently, between two people instead of one, which changed the weight not because the weight was smaller, but because weight distributed was weight survivable. She didn't ask for details. She would, eventually. She had the sharpest political mind he'd ever encountered, and a senator's understanding that details mattered. But not now, and he loved her for understanding that. "The babies," she said, against his shoulder. "I know." He held her. "We have time now." "We have time," she agreed. Outside, Coruscant went on in its perpetual indifferent way, and the morning light moved across the Senate district's spires, and two people stood in a quiet apartment and breathed and let the future be something they were walking toward rather than surviving through. The armor went into a sealed case in a storage unit on a middle level of the city. He'd cleaned it first. The burn marks on the chest rig, the score across the left pauldron, the soot from the ruined lighting array settled into every joint and seal. He cleaned it with the same methodical care he brought to every piece of machinery that had done its work and deserved to be properly attended to. The red blade he left in its hilt. He sealed the hilt in a separate case, locked it, placed it beside the armor, and stood in the storage unit for a moment in the low light. He thought about who he'd been when he built it. He thought about the voice on a Raxus transmission, and a 9-year-old boy in a slave quarter on Tatooine, and a Senate chamber full of people who had no idea how close the arithmetic had come to resolving differently. He thought about Rux going home. He thought about rows of clone tanks, and a Kaminoan who had made a decision and implemented it cleanly and asked nothing in return. He thought about what it meant to become something in service of a purpose, and then, when the purpose was complete, to choose what to do with what you'd become. He looked at the sealed case for a long time. He had built the thing inside it from nothing, from a fragment of corrupted crystal, and a decision made at 4 a.m. in a cabin aboard a cruiser running through hyperspace. He had worn it across 6 months and across the full distance between who he was and what he'd been willing to become. He had built it with the specific intention of becoming something that could do what needed to be done, and he had done it, and the work was finished. The question now was not whether to keep it. The question was what the keeping meant. Some part of him understood that the armor would always mean something, that putting it on was never going to be a neutral act, that the line between "I built this to protect people" and "I built this because I needed a shape for something that was already in me" was not as clear as he had told himself at the beginning, and had not become clearer across the months of using it. Both of those things were true. He had stopped expecting them to resolve into only one. He had been trained to believe that the darkness, once touched, could not be put down. He wasn't sure anymore that that was accurate. He thought what was more accurate was this: the darkness could be carried, the same way any other weight was carried, with intention and attention, and the willingness to keep asking what it was for. The moment you stopped asking was the moment it started answering on its own. He would keep asking. Then he locked the storage unit and left, and did not tell himself it was permanent, because he understood now that permanence was not a thing you declared, it was a thing you chose. Repeatedly, in the ordinary moments that didn't announce themselves as choices. He would choose. He walked up through the city's layers toward the light, and the light was there the way it always was, indifferent and total, falling on everything without distinction, and leaving it to each person to decide what to do with the warmth of it. The Jedi mourned a hero. General Anakin Skywalker, formerly of the 501st Legion, resigned from the Order following the war's end, citing personal reasons, and the Temple's official record noted the resignation with the administrative neutrality it applied to all such matters. The war memorials that went up in the following years included his name among the Jedi who had served, and that was all the record said. The galaxy never knew its protector. What had happened in the dark, the relay station transmission, and the months of operations and the Red Blade, and the facility deep below the city, was not in any archive, not in any intelligence file, not in any record that anyone living would find. It existed only in a locked case, and in the memory of the man who had done it, and in the quiet safety of hundreds of thousands of soldiers who had gone home without ever knowing what they'd been saved from. There would be no commendation, no recognition in the Temple records, which would note only a resignation. No HoloNet report, no Senate address, no memorial that named the right thing. The history that would be written in the coming years would attribute the war's end to exhaustion and economics and the removal of Dooku's coordinating presence, and all of those things were partially true, and none of them were the full truth, and that was how it would remain. Anakin had known this going in. He had made the decision in the dark of a hyperspace tunnel aboard a cruiser running toward Coruscant, and anonymity had been part of the mathematics from the first moment. A man could not do what he'd done and remain a Jedi in good standing. A man could not do what he'd done and hand the evidence to a Senate committee and expect the Senate to receive it cleanly. The endgame had always been this: a locked case, a quiet apartment, and a galaxy that got to be ordinary without knowing what it had cost. He had made his peace with that. Most days, and somewhere in the city, in an apartment with a viewport overlooking the Senate district, a man who had been a Jedi general and a shadow and a husband and a weapon held his son for the first time while his daughter slept in Padam's arms across the room, and felt in both of them the presence of the Force, vast, unhurried, patiently waiting to become whatever it was going to become. His son was small and warm and smelled like the beginning of things. His daughter, across the room, had Padam's shape of quiet even in sleep. He looked at both of them and felt the Force move through them with the uncomplicated steadiness of something that had not yet been asked to be anything other than what it was. Power, not managed or directed or in service of any plan, just present, just alive, just beginning. He looked at his son and across the room at his daughter and understood, with the bone-level clarity of someone who had spent months in the dark specifically, so that this moment could exist, that this was what the dark had been for. Not the victory, not the execution, not the architecture of a months-long campaign conducted across two identities and one irreconcilable truth. These small weights, this specific, unremarkable, completely irreplaceable this. Somewhere in the city, still breathing slow and steady, Vader kept watch. But here, in the morning light, Anakin Skywalker was just a father. And that was enough. That was, in every sense that the Force had ever meant the word, more than enough. And from across the room, Padme looked at him over their daughter's sleeping head and said nothing, and knew everything. And that, too, was exactly right. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.